Welcome back to the Christian Century YouTube channel. I'm John, and I'm joined today by one of our new writers, Hojung Lee, who has written a piece for us about Octavia Butler's fiction. The article's called The Wisdom of Earthseed. So we're going to be diving into those themes in a minute. But first, Hojung, welcome. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Hi, my name is Hojung Lee. I'm originally from South Korea. I currently work as the editorial assistant at Sojourners magazine, and I love Octavia Butler.
Great. We have that in common. So we both love these novels. I'm really curious how this essay came about. What drew you to these books? What made you want to write about these books? If you could tell us a little bit about just the process.
Yeah, so I actually came across a sermon by Reverend Dr. Mia McLean at Riverside Baptist Church. The title of the sermon was called I Intend to Survive, which is actually a direct quote from the first book, Parable of the Sowers. It was essentially So Parable of the Sower actually begins in July of 2024, and that is when Pastor McLean chose to give the sermon. But she made all these comparisons between the dystopian future that Octavia Butler predicted and our current reality. And it was really eerie how many similarities there were. Because in the sequel of the book, and Parable of the Talents, Octavia Butler predicts a Christian nationalist president that comes to power that runs on the exact slogan, Make America Great Again. I just knew that I needed to write about these books too. Yeah.
Yeah, there are some eerie similarities for sure. Well, so you mentioned that survival is one of the key themes of the Earthseed religion that is developed in these two books. For
Mhm.
those out there who haven't read these novels, could you tell us a little more about the characteristics of Earthseed, the religion that is at the focal point of these books?
Yeah, of course, I'd love to. So, Lauren, the main character of the novels, actually grew up as a pastor's daughter. And so she grew up within the traditional confines of the church. But the world around her is just so broken and full of despair that she loses faith in her father's God. And so she, in turn, decides that God is change. That is the core tenet of the religion of Earthseed. And because that is the core belief, the entirety of the religion is really centered around like practical actions, how you can like build community together, how you can just take simple steps in your everyday life to ensure survival for the next day. Like the title of the sermon, I intend to survive. That is the whole point of Earthseed. It's to ensure humanity's survival. And so Lauren, when she sees the community around her just full of hopelessness and despair, she doesn't choose to just dwell in that. Yes, you should honor the emotions that you feel, but you also need to take practical steps to ensure that you'll make it through day to day. So Lauren learns to hunt. She learns to forage. She learns what mushrooms are edible and what will kill you. Just really simple tasks. Not simple, but practical tasks.
Yeah, definitely. So in the article, you actually share a couple passages from the sacred texts of the Earthseed religion and suggest that there's some wisdom here that might be helpful for us in this time and place we're living in right now. I wanted to ask you about a couple of those quotes that you brought into the essay. The first one says this: "Belief initiates and guides action, or it does nothing." We actually discussed your article in my faith community using the Christian Century's Going Deeper weekly discussion resource. And I have to say, this particular passage, there were very mixed reactions. Some of us loved it, some of us hated it. I loved it personally. Um, I'm curious why you find this quote helpful. I'll read it one more time. Belief initiates and guides action, or it does nothing. Can you tell
Mhm.
us more about that?
I think that's a quote that is just personally, there's a lot of personal resonance in how I view my relationship with God. I definitely believe in a greater divine power that wants what's best for me. And that definitely guides the actions that I choose to take. But at the same time, I also believe in free will and choice. And so I can want something for myself and I can pray for it. And I do believe that faith and belief does play a core part in my spirituality, but at the same time, I need to be the one to choose to take actual steps to reach my goals. And so, what I really liked about Lauren's character is that she acknowledges her reality. She is able to reckon with the hard truths that America is completely falling apart. They lack there's class warfare every single day. They don't have running water or electricity. Food is incredibly scarce. They live in an objectively really difficult world. Um, and she would have every right to just kind of like wallow in that despair if she wanted to. But instead, she believes that God is change. She believes that, yes, these are current circumstances, but there's also an opportunity to change this, to pick up these broken pieces and reshape them into something better. And then she actually chooses to do that. So she believes she has hope for the future and then actually acts she actually acts toward building a better future, which I really admire.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing about your own faith journey a little bit. And I agree, she's a really interesting and inspiring character. The other quote from Earthseed that I wanted to chat about briefly that you mentioned in the essay, it says this: once or twice each week, a gathering of Earthseed is a good and necessary thing. I'm curious when you think about our world and this moment, what types of gatherings or practices do you think are good and necessary?
Mm. So I know that there's a saying that every single pastor has like that one sermon they just preach again and again. And I'm not a pastor, but if I was, I think what I would preach is that community is genuinely the answer to everything. So I have the privilege of living in an intentional Christian community at the moment, and it's just really, it's just really taught me how like liberating and radical the act of living in an intentional, loving, interdependent community can really be. And a lot of the values of Earthseed are also centered around the fact that you need to actively build community. And so within Earthseed, they have these thing called weekly gatherings. And this is a requirement of anyone who is a member of their religion. But there are opportunities to just discuss, just have really honest, open discussions about issues in their community, to reckon with them together, to make choices for the betterment of the entire group, not just one. Um, it's honestly a really radical way of living, and it's something that I'm getting to personally experience myself. Um, and even though Earthseed doesn't have the same God that I have, the Christian God, I think that Lauren genuinely exhibits the two greatest commandments, though, to love God and to love your neighbor as yourself through these gatherings. And it's through this ability to love someone else as much as she loves herself and to trust in them and to pour into them. The community that they form together called Acorn, it's just really focused on drawing in the marginalized and the vulnerable, finding strength in their diversity, in bringing in the needy. Um, just they really emphasize just love, care, empathy towards other people. And this is precisely what gives them so much strength. When you're living in a community with someone, intentionality is incredibly important, or else you'll just be like a couple of bodies living close to each other, but not together. You're not sharing life with them. And it's the sharing of life that makes it so powerful. Um, there is this, there's a verse in the book of Ecclesiastes that talks about how uh, a cord of three strands is difficult to break. I believe in that.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for chatting about this article and these books. Anyone out there who missed the piece, there will be a link in the video description below where you can check it out. Thanks so much for chatting today, Hojung.
Thank you so much, John.